Hello and welcome to the Good Leader podcast. I'm Will Vanderhart.
And I'm Will James.
And today we've got the privilege of inviting author, creative and leader Theo Brun onto the podcast. Theo, welcome to you.
Nice to see you, Will. Two Wills.
Thank you. Theo, for anyone who doesn't know you, you're a successful published author and you also do a lot of ghostwriting and you previously were a solicitor. Anything else we want to know about you?
Well, I would say these days it's all about creating things out of nothing. I mean, at the moment, doing a lot of stories and different kinds of fiction. I've done historical fiction novels, now straight into contemporary murder mystery. I do ghostwriting occasionally for other authors who bringing ideas to the table. Often they're very creative as well. Don't do so much law these days, but yeah, I worked for about 6 years in sort of city law, high finance, corporate law. Ended up in Hong Kong, and the transition between these two careers was, I suppose, worth mentioning, which was a bicycle ride from Hong Kong all the way back to England, which took about a year. So that was the kind of bridge between these two halves of my career, if you like.
And we've known each other for, 25 years. And I actually cycled the last 60 miles of that trip home with you.
You did. You could barely make it up the last hill. And that was in Norfolk, which is not a place known for its hills.
For my shame. But I mean, you had actually cycled 10,000 miles and I hadn't cycled that far. So 60 miles to me, felt like a long way.
Yeah. No, my legs were certainly probably in a different condition to yours, true.
Well, it's great to welcome you on the podcast today. I mean, we want to talk about, I guess, a few things, particularly around creative leadership, and also around, I guess, self-leadership. I mean, we're close friends. I've seen you operate the sort of challenge, if you like, from leaving a very kind of institutionalized career as a solicitor into this kind of self-driven career around publishing and writing. And I love the Wanderer Chronicles. If anyone's listening and haven't, if they like kind of Viking era,
epic adventure,
yeah,
action adventure, epic stories.
I definitely would highly recommend it. Absolutely gripping. But I mean, that's such a change. What do you need to do to move away from institutionalized leadership to then kind of go into this self-leadership space?
I've become quite sort of adept and well versed in the craft of story structure. And what I found really fascinating is the more I understand and learn about that is how applicable it is to real life. And so if I can apply some of the same thinking to what was going on in me that led from, as you said, this sort of institutionalized following a pretty well-trodden path to a path that really there was no path. It was like there was a sort of a landscape to venture out into, but there was not necessarily anyone or anything that I was definitively following. And I think that the driver that switched from one to the other was a search and a kind of hunger within me for authenticity. And, without trying to kind of inflate my own, achievement in that, it was just something that sat very awkwardly within me in that institutional career, although in a sense it was a nice pigeonholed thing to be doing and a ladder to be climbing up. There was always something inside me that was like, this just doesn't fit. And I think it was having the honesty with myself to actually look at that and try and understand what was behind that and actually respond to it that changed my course sufficiently that suddenly I was coming onto a more, let's say, true or authentic bearing, as it were, which ended up being much more creative. Like, I think I'd written myself off completely as a creative person, able to generate anything out of nothing. And that there was all kinds of reasons for that historically, of like moments through my life where my sense of creativity was torpedoed in different ways. So that was a whole reawakening that then led to, I suppose, the first inklings of having a go at telling stories and writing fiction, which was really just a bit of a shot in the dark to begin with. But as I went on, I realized, no, there's some, not unique as in no one else can do it, but there was something that was very particular to me that was coming alive and was something that, now I look at what do I have that others don't? Definitely a sense of imagination, like a capacity to imagine things. Whether I do it well and how you harness that into actually creating actual physical books is another challenge. But there's a lot going on in the imaginary space in my head, and I have a lot of weaknesses in other areas as well. But this is definitely something that I've come to recognize as a strength. So what do you do? How does that impact the choices you then make in your career? And we can talk about how it impacts the way you might go about leadership or self-leadership in my particular sort of strain of work, where it is quite an independent mode of making a living.
Wow. One of the things that strikes me is you describe that, and I love the idea of you going on this cycle ride as a kind of marker or a threshold, through that whole, almost like a rite of passage or something. But when you describe being in law and in that sort of institutional environment, I mean, I know that some people do love being lawyers, and some people feel that's what they're made to do. But I imagine you probably weren't the only one who was in that space wondering, is this really what I'm made for? And
no, I think that's why the legal profession is in the shape of a pyramid, is the ones that make it all the way to the top. And this was another friend's description rather than my own, tend to be paranoid perfectionists. Because I guess each career has a character type which it favors. And I think in the law, it's quite naturally risk averse, but I suppose conformist type, but with high intelligence, would make their way up that pyramid. And those for whom maybe law is not the best fit, usually end up, if they've got a little bit of initiative and I guess the same kind of itchy feet or sense of instability as I felt, turn their eyes horizontally to something else that may be more appropriate for them. And so you do get at a certain level in the career, maybe 6 to 10 years into a legal career, people leaving and finding something else to do, whether it's their own business or, often from the big law firms I was working for, they go and work they become the clients instead of the lawyer. And so they go work for big finance institutions or whatever. But yeah, I think for me, there were indications. The kind of law I was doing was international arbitration law. So it was what's called contentious law. So court cases or anyway, dispute resolution between two different parties. And so with that came a lot of witness statements. And at the level that I was at, I was often responsible for these witness statements. So I would interview a witness, write the story, and what I would produce would be this sort of highly embellished, quite dramatic version of events. And then I would get it back from the partner would review it, and he'd say, no, we can't say that, we can't say that, we can't say that. Every sentence has to be a fact that's verifiable. So there was some hints of, the color that comes with telling a good story were there in my legal career. And actually, I think, looking back, I understand that I think there are a lot of people in the law, which is a very wordy profession, possibly could make great writers and often go on to become good writers in their own sense. But that has been an interesting discovery in me as a self-leader, let's say, that creativity itself can kind of be suppressed. And you've got to maybe examine within yourself, what are the indicators of the kind of creativity which you can cultivate in order to bring forth those things that maybe are kind of residual within you and could really bless you and the world in terms of your creative outflow. And just having seen that in myself, I think if you told me 15 years ago the kind of creative capacity that I would have done since, I wouldn't have believed you, because there was very little sign of it at that point. So that's something I tend to encourage, anyone who I speak to about creativity to explore, is there's probably a lot more creativity within you than you might give yourself credit for.
So interesting, Theo. I remember when you
You went in when you were cycling. I think it was 10,700 miles that you cycled from China back to the UK. That you crossed the Taklamakan Desert. Is that right?
Taklamakan.
The Taklamakan, and that was a desert in Mongolia. Is that correct?
It's in Western China. It's in Xinjiang, which is the westernmost.
And then it means something, doesn't it?
Yeah, it means once you go in, you don't come out.
Right. So
in the Uyghur language.
Okay.
Taklamakan.
Right. So once you go into this desert, you won't come out again because presumably because of bandits or because of the desert conditions or whatever. So you actually cycled across this desert.
Yeah.
How did it feel?
Well, it's a great illustration for a lot of challenges in life. So I kind of lived this experience of there is only forward motion. You can only go forward. Because what was the alternative? That I'd set myself this task of cycling home from Hong Kong, and China, most of China had been a fascinating place, not what I expected, beautiful place. And then you come to the edge of this desert, the Taklamakan Desert, and it actually represents where the end of the Chinese Wall historically ended. And I remember standing on this kind of historical reconstruction of a fort and looking west, and all you see is this kind of pale dust land of the desert lying ahead of you, and thinking and feeling real trepidation in my gut, knowing that people through the last 2,000, 3,000 years had stood in a similar position with equal trepidation, because you just don't know what's to come. But I couldn't just sit there in the middle of China, and I couldn't go back. So it's forward or nothing. So I think and the very next day, that was actually quite a nice day when I was at the start of that moment. The next day was horrendous headwind, to the point where I couldn't actually ride the bike, and I found myself in the middle of nowhere, literally pushing this bicycle heavy laden with all my gear, going about 5 kilometers an hour, thinking it's about 200 kilometers till the next city. So you can work out how long that was going to take. So, it was disheartening, it was challenging, but at the same time, it felt about as real as anything I've ever done, in terms of challenge, and had to keep interesting in terms of making that analogy between, for example, being in the middle of a novel and you think you can't see the end of it, you can't see whether anything you've done up to this point is really any good, is working, you just got to keep going. That analogy often is one I sort of slip back into. Like, if you just keep turning the crank on the bicycle, you will eventually get to the end, the other side of the desert. And like, deserts can be massive and demoralizing, but they do also come to an end. And I suppose I've lived that. So that too is an encouraging sort of thing to have realized and experienced. It's like, however bleak a situation may feel, just keep going forward, and it will end. And so the landscape does change, and then you can respond accordingly.
Wow, mic drop moment. I mean, that sums up our podcast right there, Theo. Thank you. What an amazing illustration, to apply to so many situations. I guess that transition, the desert almost represents a kind of psychodynamic transition between your previous life as a lawyer and then your new life as a writer. Is solitude a kind of key energy for self-leadership? Particularly for creative leadership, do you find that you need space for things to be generative? Because a lot of our leaders today want to make changes. They want to do things differently, if you like. They want to cross the Rubicon. But life is so full, they maybe don't ever navigate a space of transition, or they feel like they're unable to kind of leave the fort and get on the bike. Have you found that those seasons of solitude of energized change?
I think people have different personalities. You can do all these tests, can't you, and discover whether you're more introverted or extroverted. And funnily enough, I did do one a bit like that, which in a way provoked that journey back in Hong Kong. And the discovery was I was exactly in the middle on absolutely everything, which means that I was as comfortable being extrovert as I was introvert. Now, but that I think holds true to today, that I enjoy involvement with other people, but in my introvert times, I do find that a lot of, I guess that thinking, that energy regeneration, that space, particularly for faith, for God to have his moment to speak something into what I'm thinking about my own life. It's a very useful place to go to, if you like, the metaphorical desert. You're going to hear from your God, as it were, in the desert, as a lot of the kind of stories of history have shown. But then, and definitely, I've noticed that where in this kind of busy life, even as an author, which is a relatively isolated kind of daily existence, there's a lot of noise and a lot of voices that you can fill your mind with and fill your imagination with. It's not that helpful, whether it's social media or kind of screaming children. They're equally unhelpful, I would say. So yeah, you've got to build in and commit to those moments in your routine, I guess, where you give some airtime to just nothing really, or the kind of silence and peace of allowing some things to bubble to the surface that may be really significant. They may be just creative ideas to do with, let's say a story I'm working on. They may be more relevant to my sort of substantial life of what are the right decisions to make in respect of my family or my career or something like that. So, it's a personal thing, but I recognize and try to hold on to the value of creating that space, that sort of introvert desert space, if you like, for myself.
Amazing. Thank you. Really helpful.
Yeah. What does that desert space look like in normal life? Like, how do you find trips into the wilderness to allow those different voices to emerge and to identify them?
Well, for me, driving, long journeys, anything with movement, interestingly, sort of provokes thought, and then often ideas that you wouldn't necessarily, they're sort of stirred up in a way that they come to the surface. Definitely a little exercise. My exercise tends to take the form of running. And often I'll waste it by listening to a podcast. But when I'm not to do down podcasts, they have their moments and place. But it's very easy with so much great content, for example, to just constantly fill your head with other people's thoughts and what have you. And actually, it's when I consciously turn that off and maybe listen to music and go for a run or a walk. I've got a dog, so often, by necessity, I have to be out there and away from my desk, away from the kind of substantive doing of my life into another context. Those are good times where it's not exactly a desert experience, but it's a let's call it a garden experience, because that would actually be, the place where I walk my dog. It is a sort of little park, little garden. And those are, key moments of just a breather, parenthesis within your busy life, where something else can stir up inside of you. And of course, that you can layer into that prayer, which is something that, we would all understand. Sometimes I am more deliberate about that in the mornings. Again, it's kind of contingent on family life, but when I can create that space in the morning, then I found that incredibly helpful in terms of pushing out thoughts, as it were, and receiving something back which speaks to me, speaks to different situations in my life, speaks to creativity, and that has been incredibly valuable as well.
As we kind of come into land in this podcast, thinking particularly about application, and a lot of the people who listen to this podcast, not all, but a lot of them will relate to the idea that actually they are struggling with creativity. I mean, we would say probably to innovate. To innovate is to stay alive. Change is here to stay, and the pressures on leadership today are always about innovating and issuing change. They're struggling to engage with creativity, but the mark of their lives is over busyness. That actually there's so many, you described so many voices, so many noises, so much distraction, and lots of that will be necessary distraction. They'll need to respond to 100 emails a day or whatever it happens to be. What would you say to someone who, is in the weeds of over business and wanting to be more creative, wanting to be more innovative in their area of work?
Yeah, I think I do have a pretty considered answer on that, because it's something I've had to deal with, is looking at the imagination. Like, of course, my imagination is, in a sense, more conventional use of it, in the sense of dreaming up a story from nothing. So when you think of imagination, you often might associate it with something like writing a novel. But of course, whatever your walk of life, whatever your business, demands to create something or move something forward from where it is, or create something out of nothing. And I've discovered that the imagination is an incredibly powerful asset that we all possess. But I've also discovered that the more time and the more use you put it to, the more it gives you. So, but often we're afraid of the blank page. And I can say this as a writer, or anyone who has to write their essay. If you remember back to your school days of like, oh no, I've got an essay crisis, I just don't want to go there. So you leave it till the last minute. But being comfortable with sitting there with a blank page and just waiting and asking your imagination the question. Of course, that requires time. That requires a little hump to get over in terms of fear, because initially that fear of connection, that's why people procrastinate. That's why I procrastinate. It's like you're afraid that nothing's actually going to come. But I think having faith that your imagination will deliver up something to you. And you can put that to the test by looking back over time, over your sort of own personal track record. You go, oh yeah, I had that idea. Yeah. And also capturing those ideas that seem quite obscure, seem a little maybe out of context at moments. But often I found those can be, again, my academic background was in archaeology. Those little ideas that your imagination throws out could be like stumbling across something in a field, let's say, or you with your
my metal
detector. Yeah, you get the beep,
Yeah.
And then you find something and you sort of dig around where that thing is, and you dig down and it turns out into something quite substantial or quite valuable, or something that's really going to take you somewhere. And so that's what I would encourage people, is give space to your imagination. Don't be afraid of the blank page. And when something is given to you, or when your imagination gives something to you, then spend some time like digging around it and see whether it goes anywhere. Not all of them will, but some of them might.
Such helpful advice.
I think that idea, there's that Joseph Campbell idea around this: in the cave you fear to enter is the treasure that you seek.
Yes.
And
that's very true.
It's so obvious. It's very direct as a writer that you're sitting there with a blank page, but so often we can take the thing that we fear, or where we sense our fear is, and we can avoid it. And actually that's really negative energy, and it really trips us up and it traps us. But to choose, like you're saying, to lean into the fear often is so creative, and it really wakes us up. And I love what you're saying around that. It's the same thing as moving out of sort of distraction and procrastination. It's kind of taking something head on and trusting that we've got what it takes. We don't know how we're going to get to the other side of that desert, but somehow we're going to trust that we've got what it takes. I find that really inspiring and encouraging reflection.
So helpful. Right. If people want to engage, obviously, with your work, if they want to know more, if they want to read one of your books, where should they go?
Well, you can find my books on Amazon, or under my name, Theodore Brun, Brun. You can find me on Twitter at Theodore Brun, and I'm also on Instagram at Theo Brun, so TheoBrun.
Great.
They're probably the best places to find me.
Well, Theo, we really appreciate you having you on the podcast this week, and such. I think everyone's going to walk away with kind of the desert in their mind and ask themselves, what desert do I need to cross today, and maybe take more courage to do that. It's really inspiring, and we're really grateful to you for all that you've placed into this podcast today.
Brilliant. It's been a pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Thank you too for joining us at the Good Leader podcast today and engaging with our content. I'm Will Vanderhart.
And I'm Will James.
And we look forward to seeing you very soon in our next episode.